Chapter 5. I came awake with a jerk out of a nightmare I hadn't had for a long time. A dream where I was in some dark blind alley and something was coming for me. Some dark, hunched monster that creaked and dragged itself along. A monster that would drive me insane if I saw it. Bad dream. I hadn't had it since I was a little kid, and I was a big kid now, 9 years old. At first I didn't know where I was, except it sure wasn't my bedroom at home. It seemed too close, and it smelled different. I was cold and cramped, and I had to take a whiz, something awful. There was a harsh burst of laughter that made me jerk in my bed, except it wasn't a bed, it was a bag. "So she's some kind of fucking bag," Al Lathrop said from beyond the canvas wall. "But fucking's the operant word there." Camping. I was camping with my dad and his friends. I hadn't wanted to come. "Yeah, but how do you get it up, Al? That's what I want to know." That was Scotty Norwis, another one of Dad's friends. His voice was slurred and furry, and I started to feel afraid again. They were drunk. "I just turn off the lights and pretend I'm with Carl Decker's wife," Al said, and there was another bellow of laughter that made me cringe and jerk in my sleeping bag. Oh, God, I needed to whiz, piss, make lemonade, whatever you wanted to call it, but I didn't want to go out there while they were drinking and talking. I turned to the tent wall and discovered I could see them. They were between the tent and the campfire, and their shadows, tall and alien-looking, were cast on the canvas. It was like watching a magic lantern show. I watched the shadow bottle go from one shadow hand to the next. "You know what I'd do if I caught you with my wife?" my dad asked Al. "Probably ask if I needed any help," Al said, and there was another burst of laughter. The elongated shadow heads on the tent wall bobbed up and down, back and forth, with insectile glee. They didn't look like people at all. They looked like a bunch of talking, praying mantises, and I was afraid. "No, seriously," my dad said. "Seriously, you know what I'd do if I caught somebody with my wife?" "What, Carl?" That was Randy Earl. "You see this?" A new shadow on the canvas, my father's hunting knife, the one he carried out in the woods, the one I later saw him gut a deer with, slamming it into the deer's guts to the hilt and then ripping upward, the muscles in his forearm bulging, spilling out green and steaming intestines onto a carpet of needles and moss. The firelight and the angle of the canvas turned the hunting knife into a spear. "You see this son of a bitch? I catch some guy with my wife, I'd whip him over on his back and cut off his accessories. He'd pee sitting down to the end of his days, right, Carl?" That was Hubie Levesque, the guide. I pulled my knees up to my chest and hugged them. I've never had to go to the bathroom so bad in my life, before or since. "You're goddamn right," Carl Decker, my sterling dad, said. "What about the woman in the case, Carl?" Al Lathrop asked. He was very drunk. I could even tell which shadow was his. He was rocking back and forth as if he was sitting in a rowboat instead of on a log by the campfire. "That's what I want to know. What do you do about a woman who lets someone in the back door, huh?" The hunting knife that had turned into a spear moved slowly back and forth. My father said, "The Cherokees used to slit their noses. The idea was to put a cunt right up on their faces so everyone in the tribe could see what part of them got them in trouble." My hands left my knees and slipped down to my crotch. I cupped my testicles and looked at the shadow of my father's hunting knife moving slowly back and forth. There were terrible cramps in my belly. I was going to whiz in my sleeping bag if I didn't hurry up and go. "Slit their noses, huh?" Randy said. "That's pretty goddamn good. If they still did that, half the women in Placerville would have a snatch at both ends." "Not my wife," my father said very quietly, and now the slur in his voice was gone, and the laughter at Randy's joke stopped in mid-roar. "No, of course not, Carl," Randy said uncomfortably. "Hey, shit, have a drink." My father's shadow tipped the bottle back. "I wouldn't slit her nose," Al Lathrop said. "I'd blow her goddamn cheating head off." "There you go," Hubie said. "I'll drink to it." I couldn't hold it any more. I squirmed out of the sleeping bag and felt the cold October air bite into my body, which was naked except for a pair of shorts. It seemed like my cock wanted to shrivel right back into my body. And the one thing that kept going around and around in my mind, I was still partly asleep, I guess, and the whole conversation had seemed like a dream, maybe a continuation of the creaking monster in the alley, was that when I was smaller, I used to get into my mom's bed after Dad had put on his uniform and gone off to work in Portland. I used to sleep beside her for an hour before breakfast. Dark, fear, firelight, shadows like praying mantises. I didn't want to be out in these woods 70 miles from the nearest town with these drunk men. I wanted my mother. I came out through the tent flap, and my father turned toward me. The hunting knife was still in his hand. He looked at me, and I looked at him. I've never forgotten that. My dad with a reddish beard stubble on his face and a hunting cap cocked on his head and that hunting knife in his hand. All the conversation stopped. Maybe they were wondering how much I had heard. Maybe they were even ashamed. "What the hell do you want?" my dad asked, sheathing the knife. "Give him a drink, Carl," Randy said, and there was a roar of laughter. Al laughed so hard he fell over. He was pretty drunk. "I got a whiz," I said. "Then go do it, for Christ's sake," my dad said. I went over in the grove and tried to whiz. For a long time it wouldn't come out. It was like a hot, soft ball of lead in my lower belly. I had nothing but a fingernail's length of penis. The cold had really shriveled it. At last it did come in a great steaming flood, and when it was all out of me, I went back into the tent and got in my sleeping bag. None of them looked at me. They were talking about the war. They had all been in the war. My dad got his deer 3 days later, on the last day of the trip. I was with him. He got it perfectly, in the bunch of muscle between neck and shoulder, and the buck went down in a heap, all grace gone. We went over to it. My father was smiling, happy. He had unsheathed his knife. I knew what was going to happen, and I knew I was going to be sick, and I couldn't help any of it. He planted a foot on either side of the buck and pulled one of its legs back and shoved the knife in. One quick upward rip, and its guts spilled out on the forest floor, and I turned around and heaved up my breakfast. When I turned back to him, he was looking at me. He never said anything, but I could read the contempt and disappointment in his eyes. I had seen it there often enough. I didn't say anything either. But if I had been able to, I would have said, "It isn't what you think." That was the first and last time I ever went hunting with my dad.